Evening, everyone. Welcome to Week 1 American Government. Again, my name is Michael Orff, and I'll be an instructor this semester. I hope you had a chance to watch the introduction video I posted last Friday. Become familiar with the class and the process. I apologize for this not being posted last night or ran into a bit of technical difficulty, but it's up tonight. Now, what I want to do is just take a few minutes, 10 or 15 minutes, and go through the PowerPoint slides for chapters 1 and 2, and just talk about them a little bit in preparation for your quiz and also for the discussion posting. So chapter 1 is pretty straightforward. It just asks the question, what should we know about American government? And it really looks at 4 different questions that we're going to be discussing really throughout the course, but kind of start off the book, we're going to look at them in the first chapter. And the first question is simply, why have a government? As you notice, I'm going to have the PowerPoints up like this, easier for me to see and for you to see as well. And your book talks about why to have a government, but really the purpose of government is to govern. And I know that sounds cliche and easy to say, but without a government you have chaos, you have anarchy, you have no one to protect people from each other. And it really goes back to what is the purpose of government as well, which is a question that's really been debated since probably 1600s, if not earlier. 2 famous individuals, John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, really took different approaches at the purpose of government. Locke believed the purpose of government was to protect liberties, to protect people's property, to protect people's abilities from those who would take them from each other. Rousseau thought the purpose of government was to make everyone equal. And both of those, in some respects, are very different arguments, but both at least said, this is what I believe government's for. And so government's really there as a means to manage people's expectations, what people can and cannot do in our society. Now, of course, in the United States, we have a democracy. And now, there are different types of democracy. The first type your book talks about is what's called a direct democracy, which is a system in which people vote on every issue that comes before that group, whether it be taxes, whether it be new roads, whether it be highway projects, new school systems, whatever it may be, every eligible individual votes. Now, a lot of times people think that we have a true democracy, and we really don't. When you talk about a true democracy, most people are referring to a direct democracy. Sorry, the word's it's hard for me to get out, but that's not what we have. We have more of what's called a representative democracy, in which people elect other individuals to make decisions for them. And the idea here is that that government will do what is in the best interest of everybody, not the rich, not the poor, not the middle class, but what does everybody need? What's best for them? You also have a type of democracy called a republic, which is a democracy in which power is vested in representatives selected by means of popular competitive elections. We have some of that as well. We do have elections, but it's a little bit different setup. And then legitimacy, again, is something that people sometimes question. Certain rulers, certain actions of government, do they have a legitimate right to do that? Do they have a legitimacy to that claim? We've seen that in our own elections, when we have questions about whether or not someone won an election. And so there are oftentimes questions about legitimate authority, legitimate power, legitimate control. The book also talks about 2 types of democracy. What we have in the United States, which is a presidential system, which power is divided among 3 different groups of people. You have the presidential executive branch, the congressional branch, and the judicial branch. And of course, we have that system set up based upon our Constitution, so that no one group can gain total power. You then have what's called a parliamentary system, which is what Great Britain, Germany, a lot of the European nations have, in which you elect a national legislature, and then that group of people chooses the chief executive. So, for instance, in this country, if we did that, we would elect people to the House of Representatives, and then that body would then choose who would be president. Again, a lot of European nations have this, but we really have gone a completely different direction, in which we have given the power to the individual people, not the elected people, to choose our president. And so your chapter then ends with these two questions. Who governs? And really that's a very tough question to answer a lot of times, because a lot of people think the rich govern, they have the power, they have political resources. A lot of people think special interest groups govern. It's really a question of a lot of different people having access to the resources necessary to make a change, to make a difference. The Founding Fathers hoped that no one would be able to successfully dominate the system. But of course we know that's not always the case. The other question is then, to what ends are those people going to govern? Are rich upper class people going to govern in an attempt to pass more tax breaks for large businesses? Are more liberal-minded politicians going to govern in order to try to level the playing field between the rich and the poor? And we really have to figure out what the intentions of the individuals are to understand why they're governing, to understand why they want to have power and why they want to have control. So that's really what Chapter 1 is about. Different types of government, and then who's governing and why are they doing it? What's the purpose? Chapter 2, give me a second while I pull it up here. Sorry. I have to go back to the PowerPoint here. Forgive me while I'm doing this. It's opening up right here. So Chapter 2 is looking at the foundation of our Constitution, or of our government, which is a Constitution. And it starts off with a very interesting question, which is the problem of liberty. Now, the idea with liberty is that you have to have a government to protect liberty. But you also have to have the ability to protect people from government. Our founders viewed people as generally individuals that could be corrupted, individuals that were power hungry, individuals that were only looking out for themselves. And so they wanted to create a government that was strong enough to protect the individual liberties of others, but not so strong that people's liberties would be taken away from them. And so it's really trying to create that perfect balance that they were aiming for. Now, as a lot of you already know, the Articles of Confederation were our first form of government. And in reality, it's not a government. It's a confederation. It's a loose association of individual states, in this case, individual colonies, in which the individual groups, whether it be a state, a colony, whatever it may be, retain their sovereignty, retain their ability to control themselves. And really, the Articles of Confederation were simply an attempt to keep everyone together in a reaction to what they'd experienced under the British rule. So this was an attempt to really go completely away from what they experienced in Great Britain. The problem was that it wasn't strong enough. It didn't have any power to regulate. There was no power to protect people. There was no power to regulate trade or regulate commerce or collect taxes, which may all sound good, but then how do you also defend yourselves? One colony will not be strong enough to defend itself against an attack from Spain or France in 1781. And so, under the pretense of trying to work out some trade disputes between some different colonies, and they came together in 1787 to come up with a better system of government. And there were two options, if you will. And it really, again, it was is a pretense to solve trade disputes, but really each of the states have been experimenting with their own forms of government. They had realized that what they were trying wasn't working. You can see the slide here, Mr. Shays' Rebellion, which was really kind of the breaking point. A farmer in western Massachusetts led a rebellion against the government, and the government of Massachusetts didn't even have enough money to pay their soldiers to go out into western Massachusetts to put the rebellion down, and so some rich colonists there raised enough money to go out and put the rebellion down. But it signaled the point of, hey, we can't do anything to protect ourselves. We need something a little bit stronger. And so when the Constitutional Convention first met, they had a major issue to solve. How powerful and what was the country going to look, what was government going to look like? Large states, of course, want everything based on population because they want the most power, they have the most people, therefore we should have the most power. Smaller states thought, you know, they've got more people, but that doesn't mean they should have more of a say in how things are operating. Everyone should have an equal say in this. So they came up with what was called the Great Compromise, which the House of Representatives, of course, is based upon how many people you have in your state. Your representation is based on your state population, and then you also have the Senate, which is simply everybody gets 2 representatives. And again, this is known as the Great Compromise. And it satisfied both groups. The large states were going to be able to have more power in the House, while in the Senate, each state would have the same representation. And in the Constitution, there were 2 key principles. In your textbook, in the slide here, it tells you what they are. But basically, it's this. One is that ultimate authority is going to rest for the central government, but that it's also shared. That of matters of national importance, of matters of national defense, national trade, the central government would have power. In all other areas that the state was in charge of, they would have power. What I mean by that is if something was a state issue, so for the longest time the federal government didn't get involved in education. The federal government didn't get involved in intra-state trade, that is, trade within a state. Those things still relied upon, or were still governed by the states themselves. But things of a national interest, a national nature, the central government was in power. You also have the idea of the separation of powers, which is where the idea of the legislative, executive, and judicial branches come into play here. Again, the idea is that no one branch of government will become too powerful. So you have the separation of powers at the federal level, but you also have a separation of power between the federal government and the state governments as well. Now, not everybody was in favor of this. There was a group of people called the Anti-Federalists who simply thought the Constitution had gone too far. That what they needed was something more along the lines of their Articles of Confederation. Anti-Federalists, as they were called, wanted a very small republic with leaders chosen by the people, frequent elections, a completely separated system of power, so that the federal government would remain weak and that the states would still have most of the power. The Federalists, though, those who favored the Constitution, wanted most of the power to stay within the central government. And you can really see this in Federalist 10 and 51. Now that's it for Chapter 2, except for Federalist number 10. And I want to take a look at it just real briefly as well. And the PowerPoint for Federalist number 10. And again, this is James Madison's attempt to point out the need for the Constitution. And in this, he asks some very basic questions. And basically in this he says, if you do not have a strong Constitution, then a faction of people are going to gain power. And a faction of people, in most cases, are going to be against the rights of others in the community. because they're going to want things that are in their own favor, things that help them out. So why are factions an issue? Madison says because in every Republican history that has had factions, it has died. It has ceased to exist. If you look at our own country's history with the Civil War, even in recent years with talk, and I know it's kind of crazy to say things like this, but for several years there were talks within Texas of, and it was just random talk. It wasn't anything serious, but people were talking, do we want to form our own country? There have been talks at different times throughout the country, and people even now want to secede from the U.S. because they don't think the government's doing their job to protect their own interests. So that's why factions are an issue. You have too many factions, everybody's working for their own good and not for the good of all people. So what can be done? Madison says, get rid of the factions. Well, that's easier said than done, as we know. But the problem is, if you get rid of the factions, then you're really taking away the freedom of opinion. And Madison, of course, says that's a big mistake. That's the reason the colonists broke away from England, was because they could not give their opinion. We need freedom of speech. We need to say when we don't think things are right. Things need to be changed. So even though removing factions would be beneficial, it's a larger problem than just simply factions themselves. Possibility 2, give everyone the same opinions. Again, not possible, because we're all different people. We all have individual minds thinking in different ways. And so even though Madison saw factions as a potential problem, he really saw the different possibilities of dealing with factions as even bigger problems, and decided, no, we really can't do anything about factions. And this is his conclusion. Factions are always going to be part of the nature of man. You just have to learn how to deal with them. Option 2 is to limit the effects of factions. And if it's a minority faction, then fine, the majority rule principle will limit them. But what happens to the faction and majority? What happens when the faction is a large group of people with a lot of power? Well, and that's where you see things like the separation of power come into play, where you have your judicial branches, the executive branches, legislative branches, all there for different periods of time. Now we can all say, well, this person in the House has served for 20-something years, and this person in the Senate's been there for 30 years. But the point is, they have to be re-elected every so often. They're not there for life, except for, of course, our Supreme Court justices. And they can even be removed if they commit enough of a grievous offense. On top of that, you still have the idea of the separation of power. If factions were going to control everything, they would have to take power from the state and the federal level at the same time, which is very hard to do. And then finally, just as our country has grown, we've got more and more factions, and with those factions always butting heads and fighting amongst each other, it's been very hard for any group to really gain power. And that was Madison's opinion number 10, is we can't get rid of factions, but maybe we can do some things to limit the effects of the factions. And so that's kind of been how we have grown as a country, is you're always going to have factions. You're always going to have people who see things differently than you. But if you can limit the negative impact of some factions, if you can limit their power, their ability to cause problems, then you can deal with factions without having to take away the rights of people. Well, that's been the Federalist number 10 PowerPoint, as well as the PowerPoints for Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. I hope I've helped you in some way. Again, I apologize for this being posted on Wednesday. Next time it will be on Tuesday. Let me know if you have any problems, if you have questions. Have a great week. Please don't forget your discussion postings, and I'll talk with you again soon.